Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we're talking 1967's Bonnie and Clyde.
This week, we are talking about 1967's Bonnie and Clyde. I'm Mike Natale.
And I am Tom Lorenzo. Back
and
again.
And that was a slightly awkward intro because we are actually doing this episode, just the two of us this time around. One of us the Bonnie, one of us the Clyde. Kyle as our C.W. Moss, I guess.
You'll have to figure out which one of us is impotent.
I have to say, the minute I started saying, the one of us is Bonnie, one of us is Clyde, I'm like, I know where he's going to go with this dig, and I didn't. You caught me out of left field on that one. You snuck up on me like a bunch of Texas Rangers in the bushes. We are here talking about Bonnie and Clyde this week. We're kind of switching up the format a bit. We've been doing this show a long time, and we wanted to kind of see if we have, if we've built up enough of your trust, folks, that you'll just trust our opinions on these films and our assessments of them. And if not,
we're sorry.
We're sorry. We'll
at the same time, you guys clicked to listen, so really, whose fault is it in the end?
Listen, I think it was good that we took a big risk on this one because, quite frankly, I don't know if there has been a film we have covered on the show across these nearly 100 episodes that was as big a creative risk as the film we're talking about today. And I think that that's something we're going to really focus on because that, I think, is an element of Bonnie and Clyde that's sort of lost to time.
Lost the time, absolutely. And, I'm sure if we went through the list, we can make arguments for some others, but they end up, another one lost to the element of time. Star Wars was one of those movies, too. Look where that got us. In the middle of a, at this time, 8-year race war. I think this was a good one for it to just be the two of us because it is one of those movies that we get every season, the handful of movies you get every season where it's just like, all right, well, this one kind of speaks for itself. We don't need someone tangentially related to the movie or is an expert on the subject of the movie or has a, sociological connection or whatnot. It's just like, hey, it's Bonnie and Clyde.
But it's funny you say that because I actually feel the opposite. I think Bonnie and Clyde. I was going to say I think Bonnie and Clyde. You said it speaks for itself. I certainly don't feel that way in terms of I know that for me, and I'll ask you about when you first saw it later, but I'll just speak to me. For me, the first time I saw Bonnie and Clyde, I was probably about 12 years old. So not necessarily the best age to see it at, right? But I was 12 years old because I've mentioned this on the show before, I think, but I got very into the AFI list before they did that 10th anniversary one because it was kind of just I knew I liked movies. And I was like, well, I want a framework where I'm going to these, I'm talking to people about movies, especially I'm 11, 12 years old. I'm talking to adults. When I go on a date to a girl's house, because, when you're 12 years old, your dates are either getting dropped off at the movies or you're going to somebody's house, right? And I'm talking to their parents. I want to, be able to talk about sophisticated films and all these things. And so I got that AFI list, and the funniest thing about it is my mother would take me to the video store, but I couldn't rent anything R-rated initially. And Bonnie and Clyde, I think, was either unrated or whatever it was, right? I ran 12 years. In fact, you know what? No, I take that back. Bonnie and Clyde I didn't get from the video store. It was my dad had bought that giant Bonnie and Clyde DVD box set that they did when that was like doing those big anniversary box sets or have you. Whatever it is, I remember watching it because it was on the AFI list and people talked about it so highly. And I thought it was good, right? I certainly liked it. But within the context of, things like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I had seen, which is from around that time, a little later. Cool Hand Luke, which is the same year, right? These kind of films, I think that it was one of those things where, absent the understanding of the history and the understanding of what went into it, I think I looked at Bonnie and Clyde and went, yeah, cool. Like, or I'd seen like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or that same year. And like these kind of films. And I didn't really understand. I mean, the most obvious thing to say is nobody watching this today, without a real understanding of the context, nobody watching this today is going to understand why people lost their shit about the level of violence in this movie. I'm not saying it's not violent, but I'm saying like when you hear about like Bosley Crowther being like, this is just a snuff film. You're like, is it?
Yeah, it's quite the contrast to the guy we talked about last week, Peckinpah, where when you go back and watch, the post-High Country movies, Wild Bunch, Pat Garrett and whatnot, and you watch the violence of his movies, those still pack a fucking wallop today, even, where, nothing against Bonnie and Clyde. Things age, and sometimes, what have you, things don't pack the same visceral punch because it's the first time, maybe not exactly, but I don't know if anyone's getting the same reaction out of Last House on the Left these days than they did back in 72. But yeah, it is kind of hard to overstate how much this was just not the thing that you did. And it's funny that you brought up The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because Leone's movies got so much shit. As well received as they were in their time, they did get a lot of like pearl clutching for the amount of violence it brought to the Western genre, which was, America's export, and it was a very shining example of morality and all that. And Sergio came in and was like, but what if I make it the movies are dirty and people get hurt? And even those are just not even close to what Bonnie and Clyde does,
Well,
so
that's kind of the thing that I think is another element of this too, is like European cinema was doing this, right? It was the fact that Bonnie and Clyde synthesize, or not even synthesizes just like those European influences, but it broke a barrier in a lot of different ways. And I think if you're watching that movie without necessarily understanding where it fits in the timeline of cinema, right?
Yeah.
And how important that is. And not just how important that is, but also the idea of like, I watched that movie at, the first time I saw it. And, my brain kind of goes like, yeah, of course, Warren Beatty, right? Of course, it's Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. They're famous young movie stars. Of course they're doing this. But you don't realize how much Warren Beatty had to fight to get this thing even made. His role as a producer, the fact that even for him this was a big creative risk. Faye Dunaway was not a known entity at this point.
I mean, Beatty really wasn't even a guy, pretty much. He was like on the up, but he wasn't Warren Beatty.
He was like Timothy Chalamet at this point, right? Where he's known for being like, he's a cute actor who has actual talent, right? He could coast on booking lead roles and things. But this is the moment when Beatty decides, I'm going to take control of my career in a big way. Or Tom Holland is another example, right? I know we've evoked Tom Holland.
Tom Holland feels like the right example because...
And I mean like pre-producing Beatty.
No, but like Holland feels like the right fit for this analogy because Beatty was a guy that was getting attention, but it like his movies really weren't connecting. It was like, this guy's got something, but I don't know if the movie's failing him or if he's failing them. Like, what's going on with this kid? And then, yeah, this is the movie where he takes control, shows the world what he's got, and he becomes Warren Beatty. Like, there's like, for him, not just cinema, but like for him, there's pre Bonnie and Clyde and post Bonnie and Clyde.
Absolutely.
So,
and
and Faye Dunaway,
and that whole cast, and Hackman, and
my
this
God,
is
Hackman.
the first. It's only one scene, but this is the first movie role for Gene Wilder.
Yep.
And then by the next year, he's doing the producers.
Yep.
And Arthur Penn, obviously, he had already had The Miracle Worker, but this is still a big breakthrough. But I say all that to say, and then I want to get to your side of things, Tom. But like, for me, I think one of the things that has always kind of struck me at the time is, I knew Bonnie and Clyde, and I knew about this big Oscar year that we will obviously talk about, this year that is covered extensively in Mark Harris's exceptional book that I think we're going to be drawing from a lot, which is Pictures in a Revolution. But I had seen Bonnie and Clyde, and I think I had seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and at some point I saw In the Heat of the Night, and I understood their place. But for me, I saw The Graduate when I was about 17, and I've mentioned on this before. Maybe I think my favorite American film, an argument for the greatest American film ever made. And I think what I sometimes wonder when we talk about this year, and I want to get into this as we discuss it later, we'll talk on it a bit more. I want to make sure we get to your first time seeing Bonnie and Clyde, but I obviously was very influenced by The Graduate. I felt like, especially when we were coming up in that kind of boom of like 2000s indie cinema, the Garden State, the Eternal Sunshine, all of that, the Junos, what have you. I think we certainly felt like The Graduate was much more the most influential film out of that group than a Bonnie and Clyde. One of the things I wonder if it's a case of Bonnie and Clyde has a huge seismic impact on the culture in 1967, and now today The Graduate has emerged as the more influential film, or is it something where the influence of Bonnie and Clyde has so spread and so saturated all aspects of American cinema that it's just harder to identify in the DNA of contemporary films how much of an impact it had? Because I feel as though you don't hear it discussed with as much emphasis now as you did even in the textbooks we were reading in college. And that's not a denigration of the film. It's me trying to kind of figure out, like,
I think it's the second thing. Okay. I think it's the second thing, mainly because I do think the influence is everywhere. I do think it's just in terms of what it did for violence on screen is just something that you can't really get past. I think it's the way it brings the crime film down to humanity and really isn't about the crimes as much as it's just about these two, and leading up to the tragedy of the ending, quote unquote tragedy. I have opinions about the way this movie portrays these two, but and also I think there just has something to be said of, I think the kind of movies that Bonnie and Clyde influenced are still being made at a more steady clip, where the movies that The Graduate made are not movies that are really getting made anymore, and if they are, they're TV shows. So I think that's sort of, and also I just think the reason why it doesn't get talked about, I think it's the Rosetta Stone thing. I think it really is just a case of, well, it's the one that kicked the door down, but others have come after it with an even bigger impact, And, like 2 years later, Peckinpah kind of almost rewrites it again with what he does with the Wild Bunch. And then all throughout the 70s with the horror movies, the 80s with the excess of the action movies, the French, what they were doing in 2000s with horror, the Koreans with the
Well,
2010s and all that.
I think that's a super interesting point, because I want to touch on that, because I think, in a way, European cinema coming into America around this time, two of the things being remarked upon was the violence, but also the sexuality. Right now, Bonnie and Clyde does not have robust sexuality in any particular way. In fact, very much the opposite.
Quite literally the point of the movie that the guy can't get a point.
Except that it almost didn't. Originally, it was supposed to be a menage a trois. Do you know this?
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be like C.W. Moss was supposed to be involved. There was a big menage a trois sequence, and it got cut from the film. And everybody has a different reason for why it got cut. But the one I loved the most, I forget who it was that made the comment now. I don't believe it was Arthur Penn. It was somebody. I might have it in my notes. But in any event, their basic argument was, they go, well, the menage a trois is weighing this thing down too much, because it took Jules and Jim a whole movie to figure this thing out, and they didn't have to rob banks. And it's like, what a good line. But I'm saying that in terms of, like, European films and their sexuality opened a floodgate in America that America then took forward. But I do think, like, it's similar to, you can watch I Am Curious Yellow, right? Which is chock full of explicit sexuality and nudity for half its runtime. And half its runtime is conversations about socialism, right? And that becomes a big hit in America, and I think a bunch of American film producers ultimately determined, like, can we just show the fucking and cut out the socialism, right? And I think similarly, talking about Bonnie and Clyde and and just talking about it from the angle of the violence, you're acknowledging, like, Peckinpah and the violent 80s movies, but it's a little bit of, like, Bonnie and Clyde opens the floodgates by going, like, let's make this heavily French New Wave influenced, ultra-violent, screed about America, and then a bunch of other filmmakers afterward go, let's cut out all the French New Wave shit and let's just have the blood. I'm not saying that about Peckinpah specifically.
No.
That's
I mean, that's a conversation we had in Ride the High Country about violence in cinema, which is that, when it's good, but when hucksters get their hands on it, it dilutes the product. And some films are able to, over time sustain their power, even in the face of what the hucksters have done to either their movies or their genre or just the violence itself, like a Peckinpah, like a Wes Craven or John Carpenter, Dario Argento, all these guys, Bava. But then sometimes you got a movie like this that take out its place in history and just, watch it as a movie, which we did for this episode. We both rewatched it, and you go, yeah, there's violence in this, but this isn't, like, really anything more out of the ordinary from an episode of, like, Starsky and Hutch or Miami Vice or something. Like, not to be mean to the movie, but it's like and it doesn't do it any favors.
It's a bit more than TV, though. I think you kind
of...
No,
it is a bit more than TV. It is a bit more than TV, but when you do watch it in comparison to the stuff that comes, again, just 2 years later with Peckinpah, the squibs in this feel almost like, well, there's some blood in the squibs, but it's not crazy, where just 2 years later, geysers of blood are flying everywhere, and just like, oh, what the fuck happened in 2 years? Jesus Christ.
So tell me, before we get into the registry of everything, when was your first time seeing Bonnie and Clyde? I know I've gone on quite a bit
My first time was very late in life. It was just one of those movies that, escaped me, and I'd go, I'll get to it at some point. Nothing that I was like, well, I don't want to watch it. Just, all right, I'll get to it. I watched it in 2019. The ripe old age of 29. I'd have to check my records. I'm not doing that right now. I'm pretty sure I read the Mark Harris book at the time, because I was in such a old Hollywood fervor because of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And reading that book was like, all right, well, guess it's time to watch Bonnie and Clyde. And I really liked it. You know, this isn't going to be one of those movies where I kind of begrudgingly have to give the movie its daps and be like, yeah, it fucking sucks, but I guess it's important for cinema. Hint, that'll be coming in a few weeks. But I did really like it, but even at the time, I remember going, interesting how this was what was considered almost pornographically violent in 1967, especially as I was already like, you know, elbow deep in like Peckinpah lore and fucking obviously the horror thing, you know, that defines my entire aesthetic. I just remember being like, this is good. I like what this is doing. I'm sure we'll get into it after we roll the registry statement, but remember thinking like, this feels like an interesting flip side to the coin that The Graduate is doing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't even know what the but is. I just remember like, yeah, this is good. This is really good. I really like it. There's always been something that holds me back from like full blown love.
Yeah, of course, because it's influenced by the French New Wave.
No, not even that.
That's enough.
No, it's not that, because plenty of movies have been influenced by the French New Wave that I like. It's the French New Wave that I don't like, unless it's Melville.
Or some you like some Truffaut.
I've only seen 400 Blows and I didn't like it.
Really? I thought you'd say, okay. I for some reason had recollection of you having seen more, but
I don't think Atkinson showed up multiples of a director in that French New Wave class.
Okay.
Maybe 2 Godards, maybe, but I think he purposely tried to not double up.
Okay, yeah, I could have sworn. Anyway, before we get more into Bonnie and Clyde, let's hear what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry has to say about Bonnie and Clyde.
Setting filmmaking and style trends that linger today, Bonnie and Clyde veered from comedy to social commentary to melodrama and caught audiences unaware, especially with its graphic ending. The violence spawned many detractors, but others saw the artistry beyond the blood, and it earned not only critical success, but also eventually showed at the box office. Arthur Penn deftly directs David Newman and Robert Benton's script, aided by the film's star and producer, Warren Beatty, who was also eager to push the envelope. Faye Dunaway captures the Depression-era yearning for glamour and escape from poverty and hopelessness.
Shoot the Piano Player is the other Truffaut I thought you might have seen, but I don't think you have.
No.
I think you'd enjoy that one. The reason Truffaut I bring up specifically is, of course, this was intended to be a Truffaut film.
For a very long time, yeah.
Yes, the screenwriters desperately wanted Truffaut. And it's funny because I was watching on the DVD set that came out many, many moons ago. It was like this 3-disc DVD set, or 2 discs and a booklet and everything. You know how they used to do those big deluxe sets.
Yeah.
When that came out, there was a documentary, an hour-long documentary called Revolution, The Making of Bonnie and Clyde. And there's a quick conversation with Arthur Penn where they're like, well, you know, the screenwriters were going after Truffaut or Godard. But, oh, no, it's one of the screenwriters is saying, like, oh, they were going after Truffaut or Godard. But then I think Warren told us, well, that you wrote a French script. You need an American director. And it's like a cute little wrap-up, right? But obviously, like, Mark Harris's book gets into just for how long they and Beatty were trying to court Francois Truffaut. And Truffaut was not... Truffaut was very back and forth on whether or not he wanted to do Bonnie and Clyde. He had signed on to do Fahrenheit 451. Then he tried to hand it off to Jean-Luc Godard, which I love Jean-Luc Godard. Would have been a nightmare. I do not think that would have worked at all. And then eventually Warren comes around with Arthur Penn. Now, why I think that's interesting is that Arthur Penn and Warren Beatty had previously worked together on a film that was explicitly trying to be a French New Wave style film in America. It's a film called Mickey 1.
Yeah.
And I like to do my homework. I
Yes,
like
you
to
do.
do my research. In anticipation of this particular episode, because it was nominated for and beat out in a couple of categories by this film, I watched all 3 hours of Warner Brothers' Camelot. I watched all 2.5 hours of Rex Harrison's Dr. Dolittle. Right? I watched a 1940s B picture called The Bonnie Parker Story. I will watch a lot of things in prep for this show. I want you all to keep that in mind when I state I could not finish Mickey 1.
Sounds about right.
It is. I was like all excited for it because I'm like, oh, Arthur Penn, Warren Beatty doing French Wave. That movie is fucking interminable. And Warren
now you know
knew
how
it
I
too.
feel, asshole.
Warren knew it too. He knew it was a stinker. He knew it was, and because I think part of it too, and this is what I think is interesting, is I like the French New Wave films because they've absorbed. It's the same way, like, we both of us like spaghetti westerns, things like that, which is like the idea of like they're taking an iconography that isn't theirs, right? Something they have no connection to, and they're like, well, this is kind of fanciful nonsense, so let's just take it further, right?
Well, it's the outsider's perspective of
Yeah.
being able to read a society, or in this case, a society's genre of storytelling, and being able to find the truth in it that the assembly line kind of won't let them,
or conversely, like, to literally just embrace the fiction of it, right?
Yeah.
No historian is going to tell you that in the Old West anybody ever carried around a Gatling gun in a coffin like Django. They just don't give a shit.
And that's why
It's
history is not that interesting.
Right. Mickey 1 is like trying to do French New Wave, and it's like, well, I'm a stand-up comic, and I owed a boss money, and it's like so bleak. And so you sort of see why Bonnie and Clyde catches their attention like it does, because it allows them to play with American iconography in a way that up until now only the Europeans would have
because
done.
This is, for all talk about its groundbreaking uses of violence and it's teetering up onto sexuality, this is just an RKO fucking like gangster movie. This is
not just like Warner Brothers, who ultimately produces Bonnie
Warner
and
Brothers,
Clyde.
yes.
Like,
but this is straight up just a James Cagney movie.
Yeah.
With obviously it's more artfully done. The dame is given more, she's more well-rounded. Beatty's more of a doofus and is not as like competent as a Cagney or Bogart would be, or any of these guys. And it's it's doing like what you said. It's coming in, finding new ways to look at these things, giving it more depth, and like what the French like to do, which I think works in this case. I don't think it works when Godard does it. I'm hoping he's rotting in hell. Kind of just settling down and not really caring about the plot, so to say, or like worrying about the beat by beat, like, well, we're going to show all of their robberies and all of the innocent people they killed, and like we're going to show you what the cops are doing in between, and it becomes a manhunt. It's just kind of like, no, we're just hanging out with these folks and watching their relationship grow and the growing pains of that, and how the bank robbery is a metaphor, because I make the joke, but it's the truth. His dick doesn't work. He can only perform in a bank robbery, blah, 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 all that stuff. You really don't get cop shit until the end of the movie. It's not important.
Except for that bit with the embarrassing the Texas Ranger.
Yeah. But it's like you just get, but even that is like, well, they're there.
Yeah.
But you don't really get like anything that's not them.
Well, I mean, I think
the end for the most part.
So what I really enjoyed, especially this time around, right? Because obviously, I've talked about the first time I saw it, I was very young. Obviously, I'm much more well versed in the French New Wave now. I revisited Jules and Jim recently just to kind of look at the fact that Jules and Jim is basically, I said it online, but it's your favorite filmmaker's favorite film, if you like films of the 70s. everybody, whether it's Penn, Scorsese, Coppola, every one of these guys has a story about going to see Jules and Jim. It's just for what Bonnie and Clyde may have been the American movie to break down those barriers, but Jules and Jim was the film that told all of these American filmmakers that the rules could be broken, right? Which again is why they go for Truffaut the way that they do. But one of the things I thought was interesting was the screenwriters discussing what drew them to Bonnie and Clyde, and apparently they were reading a book on John Dillinger. These were two men who were writers for, I think, Esquire at the time, and then one of them was reading a book on John Dillinger, and there was just a footnote about Bonnie and Clyde that said they weren't just outlaws, they were outcasts. And that was the genesis of this script. A script that seems to comment on late 60s society, even though it was written well before that.
Yeah.
It sort of occupies a similar space to whenever you hear George Romero talk about Night of the Living Dead and being like, I just kind of stumbled into a lot of these things. Like, they were just in the ether. I think one of the things that is kind of funny in a way about the reception that this film had at the time that I hadn't really considered is I believe it's Stanley Kramer, who obviously has Guess Who's Coming to Dinner the same year. Stanley Kramer didn't really get Bonnie and Clyde, and his reasoning for it was he said, I lived through that. It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
Right? And that is something I think we also lose when we watch Bonnie and Clyde today that I didn't even really consider because, we always talk about this a lot on the show, that our sense of history is not always like lining up with the dates, right? That there's things where people, how people like to do that thing of like, well, this person and this person were alive at the same time. H.G. Wells reviewed Metropolis. When Bonnie and Clyde are at the movies watching Gold Diggers of 1933, something just kind of short circuits a little bit up here because my brain just kind of goes like, what? No, they were longer ago than that, right? You don't necessarily think. So I texted it to you, Tom, actually, as I was watching it, but like the oddness of considering, like, again, we watched Bonnie and Clyde and we're like, yeah, of course, that was like a century ago when this happened, right? Even though it's still not really a century ago, but it feels so long ago. It feels like such a part of the past. It feels like making a Western. It feels like making a Wyatt Earp movie now. But in fact, for what they were doing, the distance between when Bonnie and Clyde actually die in 34 and this film coming out, that gap of time would be the equivalent of if somebody today, right now, released a film about the Rodney King beatings.
Yep.
So it's not just like fresh in some people's minds still, but there are people who remember these guys' antics in the paper. And so I'm not saying I'm not endorsing people like a Bosley Crowther or anything like that, reacting how they did, but I do understand in a way people who were like reading the paper about these two young people just murdering people and being like, what do you mean you make them the young romantics of your movie? What are you talking about?
Yeah, and I do think that's one of the things that does kind of rub me the wrong way about this movie, which is that, I did read Public Enemies, which gets into like all of the bank robbers at the time, not just Dillinger, like the movie did, but Bonnie and Clyde, blah, 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 all that. And I just like remember watching it and going, especially in a post Once Upon a Time in Hollywood landscape, where so many people shit their bricks about how Cliff Booth just treats the Manson family like absolute monsters. And I was going like, do you know what they did?
No.
Do you do you know what those fuckers did to that family, those people in that house? So watching Bonnie and Clyde, I'm like, okay, watching it as a movie is very good, blah, blah, blah. But then there's the part of you that knows about history goes, these were psychotic maniacs that killed a lot of people and were not like the lovey-dovey, like cutesy couple that they kind of portray in this movie. I'm like, this is this. I mean, maybe not as long ago in the past, but we're getting close to that point. But like, if you made a movie today where fucking Eric and Dylan from Columbine were kind of like, cutesy, super bad kind of kids before they shoot up the school.
So Gus Van Sant's Elephant?
I never watched it, so I don't know.
Don't do it.
I wasn't going to.
It was one truly. We talked about it when we did our Palme d'Or special, but absolutely a movie that when it came out and I saw it, I was like, a lot of interesting shit in here, I guess. And then I rewatched it recently, and went, no.
But like you get what I mean, right? Of like, putting the history aside and watching it on its own is one thing. So I can, I'm doing that, saying it's a good movie. It's a good movie. Mm-hmm. But I do think there is a little bit of that's kind of pushing it from a 5-star to a 4.5 star on my Letterboxd. And watching it this time, I wrote it on my Letterboxd review for this viewing, and I was just the whole movie watching it going, I wonder what Peckinpah would have done with this story.
I mean, here's what I'll say, right, to that. One of the things that I appreciate about this is that the movie is not actually as much of a, oh, they're two sweet lovers, as I think it gets talked about as. Because one of the things that I think it does so smartly is that the deaths in this movie are never played for laughs, right? In fact, if anything, the violence that some people so objected to, and then later most of them came around to, but, is underscoring anytime you start to laugh at Bonnie and Clyde, right? Their first getaway, right? Yeah. Where they're in the car and you're like, oh, Moss, you dummy, you tried to park the car. And then, Clyde just shoots a guy in the head.
Yeah.
And it's shocking. And I think...
And they're freaked out about it, except for Bonnie. But
yeah, but that's kind of what... it's interesting because this comes out the same year as In Cold Blood, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which, by the way, is just... It's in the registry. We will get to it one day, eventually, I'm sure, but... This is, if you have not seen In Cold Blood, Tom, my God.
Oh, no, I've seen it.
I threw it on today and was just like, oh, shit. This rules.
I've seen it. Great movie.
But it's a similar thing, right? Where it's not denying the horror of these guys' crimes, but it does make something very interesting about the idea of, like, I think, this idea of, like, oh, shit. Oh, God, what did we just do? And one of the things that I loved with that is, a lot of movies, when they do this, they kind of have, like, there's the one kill, like Rope, right? Rope does the thing where there's the one killer who's very like, we did what we did this. And the other guy going, oh, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
What I think is kind of fun not fun, but what I think is so interesting about the way Bonnie and Clyde structures this is not only does it punctuate every funny moment with horrifying violence, but Clyde is freaked out. He is not happy. He's not comfortable with the killing. And the only time we see him talk about it afterward is like Gene Hackman. Well, it's them in the movie theater, right?
Yeah.
With him trying to say like, are you kidding me? We killed somebody. We killed you. And we did this whole thing. And then later when Gene Hackman shows up as his older brother.
Yeah.
And what's like the first thing Gene Hackman says about it?
He must
you had to do it, right? Yeah, you had to do it, right? You had to do it. You had to do it. And I think it's such an interesting thing of I would not suggest that the film necessarily is, totally beholden to this idea of, oh, Bonnie and Clyde are just innocent souls. It's not saying that at all, but it is trying to take a look at Depression era America and going like, what enabled this, right? Like, what enabled this from the fact that Bonnie and Clyde get to be folk heroes to a lot of people because they're going after the banks, and the banks have been screwing over the farmers, right? Giving the man the pistol to let him shoot out the windows on his house.
Yeah.
And giving, letting both the white guy and the black guy take shots at the window, right?
Yeah.
All of that to the fact that characters like Hackman are... sitting there going like, oh, you had to do it. You had to do it. I get it. You had to do that. It's not necessarily, Bonnie and Clyde is not it's not a defense of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. It is an indictment of the entire society of Depression era America in a similar way to, I think, what we've gotten a lot better about doing now, and we were doing a lot in the 60s as well, which is looking at whatever is happening and trying to figure out, well, why did this happen? Like, what's going on that something like this occurs? You know?
I agree with that for the most part. I do just think that the movie does kind of write itself into a position of, well, this is just what Clyde is like, and he's just a criminal who robs things and is doing this to impress a girl, and they just get roped into it, and it's, like I said, kind of the only thing that can kind of get his engine going. It does maybe not, in its sort of historical revisionist way of telling the story, really give Clyde an out morally the way you're saying. Bonnie, you get, in that she's a lonely girl that's kind of got no options and is really just looking for anything to just feel alive. But yeah, no, I do definitely. It would be ignorant and just straight up lying about the movie to say that there's not scenes in the movie exploring the Depression era angle of why they became, folk legends. I do just think, which again is one of those things that rubs me wrong, is that the ending is almost feeling like it's kind of a tragedy. It's like, oh look, they got, surprise attacked by the cops. Isn't that kind of fucked up? And it's like, yeah, it is, but I know what these fuckers did.
I think that's so interesting because I've never quite read it as a tragedy in the way that you're describing. Like, I think it's more, at least to me, the way that it's presented, especially the way that it ends so abruptly, right? Is, to me, it's always been, and they imply this as it goes along. There's this thing of they're breaking the rules of society, right? They're breaking the rules. And the second half of that film, the second half of it is Bonnie having this sort of premonition. And apparently Arthur Penn wanted her to have like a full-on premonition about their death, which they wisely couldn't.
Yeah,
right?
Smart move.
But it's more the idea of, it's a very Greek tragedy. I mean, yes, I guess tragedy, but we're saying Greek tragedy. I'm saying Greek tragedy, where that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unwarranted, right? A Greek tragedy can be a story where a character like gets their comeuppance.
Oh no!
Right?
I get that, and I don't think it's an ending that's supposed to be like, poor them. They were such like Robin Hood-esque figures. But it is that, like you're saying, the Greek tragedy thing, and I just, it's one of those things where I get it from the story, the historically revisionist thing you're telling, and I'm like, I get that. And as a movie, the way you're telling this story, that works, especially in comparison to a movie that's essentially just this movie, but quite possibly the most boring movie I've ever watched, Thieves Like Us. Rest in peace, Shelley, you're a queen. It's not your fault. That movie straight up just, well, what if I did Bonnie and Clyde, but you wanted to kill yourself watching it because your eyes are melting inside your head. I lost my train of thought. It's fine.
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing I would say. It's like, I think the other thing that's important to remember is that now we only think of this for Bonnie and Clyde, right?
Mm-hmm.
For so many reasons. There were other Bonnie and Clyde movies, right? Yeah. And I think that that's sort of something where it's kind of like, now I didn't love this movie. I don't think it totally works, right? Mm-hmm. But like Ridley Scott's Napoleon is not trying to be the definitive Napoleon movie because that already exists, you know? And there's been so many Napoleon movies that it's like, no, I'm going to play with this iconography myself, right? It's like when Steven Spielberg set out to make Lincoln, he's like, I'm focusing on this one particular thing, right? Mm-hmm. This team of rivals thing. I don't need to show you the Gettysburg Address. I don't need to show you him going to the theater. Like, I can the same way that somebody can make Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and we don't need to sit down and go, well, why didn't Abraham Lincoln, after vampire hunting, try and get the emancipation? Like, no, we don't need to, I think that, I personally, with Bonnie, again, I don't have that same qualm that you do. And I think part of that is just the fact that it's playing with an iconography in a very specific way. And I think, none of them had any interest in telling the Bonnie and Clyde story. Now, there were a lot of critics at the time who got very hung up on that, who got very hung up on like, well, why are you glamorizing these people? And I think, I think it really depends, right? I think a lot of that, I'm not necessarily, it's a movie we're going to talk about on the next season of the show, right? But Badlands is an even more kind of recent set of like couple on the road killing, emulating the Starkweather homicides.
Yeah.
And it's Terrence Malick looking at that and going like, well, what do I draw from this? What resonates with me here? I think
I 100% acknowledge that this is a me problem. Okay. This is a me problem.
Yeah.
I'm not, because like I said, I can watch it as a movie divorced from the real characters for the most part. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it's that half-star thing that's just kind of I could look past it to 4.5, but if I'm going to 5, I'm just like, well, I can't get that far past it.
No, I understand. But I'm excited for a couple seasons from now when you tell me that it's only a 4.5 because you read a book and neither Butch Cassidy nor the Sundance Kid rode a tandem bike. It's a real hang-up for you.
Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid is not a 4.5 in my opinion.
Oh, really? Do you not like that film? We'll get into it another time.
On my most generous day, it's a 4.
Interesting.
I don't love that movie, especially of the George Roy Hill kind of run he went on.
Are you saying like you're more pro The Sting than Butch Cassidy?
I'm also more pro Slapshot.
This is gonna be such a weird time. You and I really do diverge with westerns. Like that's an absolute. We really do.
We do.
But in any event, we've gotten very far afield with this one. Especially
well, you know what? Okay. But, yeah. Just because the Western, this subject has been brought up, I feel like this is like something I've thought about in the interim since watching Bonnie and Clyde that first time. Did you ever see? Probably not, because it was on Netflix. Nobody see. Did you ever see that movie Netflix made a few years ago called The Highwaymen?
No, I'm aware it exists, but I never watched it.
So again, not saying that it's 100% historically accurate or not, what have you, but it gets to this interesting idea that again kind of looped back into me thinking about Peckinpah, like that this movie is playing in an almost more Western feel than a Warner Brothers crime.
Yes,
because it's the locations and like it's about a group robbing banks and it's kind of a ragtag thing. It's not very like well organized. It's all of that. It's not glamorous. Westerns aren't glamorous. Crime films are glamorous, and in that movie, The Highwaymen, it gets to this thing that these two cops, played by Woody Harrelson and Kevin Costner, that this is kind of going to be the last rodeo for them because Bonnie and Clyde pretty much represent the last time that this kind of crime is going to be a thing in this country. The FBI is ramping up. Banks are starting to be insured and get more security, and it's going to be all that. So this thing of like roving gangs of maniacs that just go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction because there's no way to like track them and there's no way to communicate. You needed this old school Western gunslinger thing. These guys that are on their way out having their one final hurrah at this moment. And I do, listen, again, doesn't ding the movie in any way, but I do wish that there was a little bit of like with the cop that is embarrassed and is eventually the one who wraps them up in body bags at the end. I do wish there was almost a sort of like, yeah, we got the Great Depression thing going on here, but a sort of, because this movie does feel like about the youth of America pushing up against what America wants the youth to be, kind of like The Graduate and like the passing of the time and everything. I do wish there was a little more like, hey, like this is something we've been dealing with for like 100 years of bandits on horseback and now bandits in, Packards. These kids, they're kind of riding the end of a dream was never really like realistic ever, and now they're kind of the last hurrah of that.
But I also think there's an element too of, I almost feel like what Bonnie and Clyde represent to some degree, or at least the energy that they bring. And I don't know how true that is for children of the 60s, because children of the 60s, kind of had it okay pre-Vietnam, right? I'm not going to suggest it, but it is a little bit like, I do wonder if, or at least like, I should say somebody who's Warren Beatty's age when this film comes out, who's 30, right? Similar with like Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, was 30 years old. Mark Harris talks about in his book, like, Dustin Hoffman was going to colleges to help try and like boost Eugene McCarthy's presidential hopes. All the young people wanted to talk to him about The Graduate, and he kept saying, I'm 30 years old. I'm not your generation, right? Like, I don't know what you're feeling. So I shouldn't say that about children of the 60s, but I do think it's similar to, not to bring to it, it's a little bit how people our age, like millennials, in their like early 30s, feel sometimes talking about politics or the state of the world with Gen Z or, even younger, which is for us, I hate to say this, but like, we remember when shit wasn't so bad, right?
Yeah.
We remember pre 9/11. We remember pre 2008 economic crash. We certainly remember pre-COVID. Like, all of us remember pre-COVID. But you know what I'm saying? We remember that, right? And I think it becomes one of those things of like, and there's certainly people like us that do that, what I'm about to describe. But like, when we hear somebody talk about like, well, it's always been fucked up and, both parties are the same and this and that. And we kind of go, no, very, very pointedly, there's a point here where shit went bad, right? Like, very pointedly. But I understand the idea of like, if you're somebody, around our age where like you were born into relative calm and prosperity, right? And then shit falls apart, you're trying to get it back, right? But there's that great shot after they're shooting at or before they shoot at the house and everything, where there's all those FDR posters up on the wall. Now, we, with the benefit of history, know what FDR does. You mentioned, Tom, like the insuring the banks, the FDIC. We know that. But Bonnie and Clyde and their generation are born into chaos, right? They're looking at all of this around them. Yeah, there was the roaring 20s, but for rural Texas, that wasn't that roaring. They're born into the shit. The system doesn't work. The system has failed them, right? And it's kind of the opposite of what we talked about with Rebel Without a Cause, where like, Sal Minio's character's pampered. These guys are relatively, calm lives and they're just bored. This is like, they are so born into the system failing. They are so born into a world where the rules don't protect anybody that they have to protect themselves, and they can break the rules because the rules don't matter. Right. Yeah. And I'm not to suggest that any of that is justified, but I do think that is one of those interesting things to sort of see that contrast as well. Like, there's a little bit of, well, you're not supposed to do that. Why? Why? To what end? I love that bit. One of the interesting elements that comes across in this film is, Clyde is in theory going to steal Bonnie's mother's car, right?
Yes.
And if you know the history of these characters and you know about Clyde's history and all of that, you could do it. But if you divorce yourself of that, as the film perhaps asks us to do, because Bonnie and Clyde don't exist before the first reel starts, you can watch this movie and very easily come away feeling like Clyde has not actually done any crimes before he meets Bonnie.
Yeah.
He could very well be scoping out her car. She makes the assumption that he's going to steal it. He talks to her about wanting a better life. And yeah, he does the robbery, but you also see that later he tries to rob the general store.
And attacked with a hatchet.
Yes, a fat butcher comes charging at him. He ends up cracking him in the skull. You see the blood, but then Clyde gets to the car and goes, "He tried to kill me. Why did he try to kill me? I didn't want to hurt anybody. You brought a gun into a grocery store."
Yeah.
Clyde, how did you see that going? Or even look at the example of, we know we can't trust anything Clyde says because when his older brother shows up, Clyde plays into the idea that he slept with Bonnie.
Yep.
Because he just doesn't want, he wants to just be whatever somebody wants to picture him as.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that is a crucial element of this too. And I think, another reason why one has to sort of divorce themselves from the history in a way, just to kind of, to play in that sandbox a bit.
No, and then listen, I like, on that, all that stuff is absolutely right on, fine, and I get that. It's all that stuff. It's just like, all that youth rebellion thing, like, which it makes it that like great counterpoint to The Graduate, where Hoffman in that is just so like crippled with being a pampered rich boy with doesn't know what to do, that he kind of just floats through life and floats through a pool many times in that movie, that he ends up sleeping with his girlfriend's mom, and he ends up ending it with breaking up his girlfriend's wedding.
But of course, he sleeps with the mom before he even has the girlfriend, which is what makes that. We'll do a Graduate.
But you know what I mean. He's just like, he's basically like an automaton. He's not even like living a real life because he can't deal with real life. And you look at these two, and they're living life, and they're just like, well, this sucks. So we're just going to be completely ruled by our id. We're just.
Well, here's the other thing that I think is interesting.
Well, they're poor. He's rich. All of that stuff.
Well, but beyond that, the other thing I think is interesting is think about it this way too, right? So Clyde, especially if you whether or not you believe that he's committed crimes before. So Clyde in this film, right, clearly wants to get with Bonnie or see something in Bonnie, right?
Yeah.
Bonnie takes him for a crook. He obviously has that great scene toward the beginning where he reads her like a fucking book.
Yep.
Right? Where they're walking and eventually like he's guessing at what she does for a living, but his voice shifts when he goes, "Waitress." And you watch her kind of shut down. But she believes he's a criminal, and therefore he is a criminal, right? But one of the things that makes their interaction so great, so again, he says he's done robberies before. You watch him rob that store theoretically, right? Like he does rob the store, but all you see at the beginning is him come out with money in his hand. Later, when they're talking to the old man, the farmer, the old farmer with his family in the car, very grapes of wrath, the property of the bank, and Clyde goes, "Oh, we rob banks," and Bonnie gets scared, right? She initially is like, "What? What do you mean we rob it?" Look, until she looks at him and gets this sort of like, I guess, erotic ecstaticism or something, from him saying that. And then, of course, later, when she says it with even more confidence, right? He says, "Oh, we rob banks." And she just, "We rob banks." Just very submitted. One of the things that I think is interesting is that Clyde seems malleable enough that, like, he'll, he just wants to get out of there, right? And he'll kind of go along with it. We're going to rob this thing. We're going to do all that. Bonnie's looking for any excuse to get out, right?
Yeah.
So when she meets this guy that from her perspective is a bank robber, right? Then she trusts that he knows what he's doing, right? She trusts that escape plan. And of course, you see that she has other interests. She loves watching the movie, right? And singing "We're in the Money." She writes her poetry. In another life, she's an actress, right?
She's
Clyde on the other. Yeah, but Clyde on the other hand, I think one of the great things you see throughout him in the movie is it's almost as though he lied his way into this, right? Bonnie just is charging ahead full steam because she's like, well, I guess this is what we do now, right? Like, I've chosen my lot in life. I've thrown in my lot with this criminal, so we're criminals now. Whereas Clyde almost has the energy of guy who lied on his resume to get a job and is now starting to realize he has to do the job.
Yeah.
So much of this throughout the movie is just, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh no, It's very
well, it's and it's one of those things that gives the movie the juice is that it is just a relationship movie, and the relationship is charted through their life of crime. And I keep harping on this because it's a thing that's is one of the truisms of Clyde that made it into this movie is that he was impotent.
Yeah.
He couldn't fuck. But you get the sense that all of this is kind of makes up for the fact that he can't have sex, and the way it's just like a guy, he just does it. Like, yeah, I do it. Yeah, whatever. I'm great. I'm gonna rob banks. Oh, great, awesome. Like, guys just like, yeah, I fuck, whatever. It's great, whatever. I stick my dick in it. It's fine. It's great, whatever. But when she gets into it,
Yeah.
She's taking this shit seriously. And just charting that, and how even without the the vision of doom, the fact that they meet the Undertaker played by Gene Wilder, and she's just like, all right, I'm the only one taking this seriously, which means I have to kind of reckon with, we're probably gonna fucking die doing this. Let's start like taking things seriously. And kind of fitting that the only time they do actually get down with the sickness is right before they die. That's kind of for the whole movie, killing is their replacement for sex, and then they finally have sex, and whoops, you get shot.
I want to talk about Dunaway for a bit, because I think that we've obviously alluded to Beatty, but Dunaway. Well,
we've talked about the man.
We've talked about Beatty to some degree, but like Faye Dunaway, obviously I appreciate Faye Dunaway, but one of the things that I thought was interesting is, past and future guest of the show, my partner Bella and I watched this together because she had never seen it. A thing I didn't realize was that she'd also never seen Faye Dunaway in anything else. Right? This was just Faye Dunaway just didn't exist for her.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, like Tom, you and I know Faye Dunaway. We know Faye Dunaway, whether it's
personally,
Chinatown Network, but Chinatown Network, Mommy Dearest. Like for us, that's a major movie star. And I think one of the things that was kind of cool about watching it with her was that she had the exact feeling that people did in 1967, which is because of the way they shoot her and everything. From the first second that Faye Dunaway shows up on screen, Bella next to me just went, well, that's just that person's too beautiful to exist. And that is the feeling you're supposed to get from the beginning. That beginning sequence of her banging on the bars of her bed like it's a prison, rolling around in the bed. Now, Tom, I know you don't love the film by any stretch of the imagination, but very clearly like that feels like Godard's Contempt, right? With Bordeaux rolling around in the bed. Like that's the same energy, but using it to essentially go, we're introducing you to our version, the American version of the most beautiful woman on the planet, but she is in a rundown, gross shack. It's such a great way to introduce that character.
Well, I mean, it's not to like take away from what Arthur Penn did on this movie and be like, well, it was obvious, but like he did the right thing when with the story of the movie, the script that they got, the angle they were taking. That's how you have to shoot Bonnie. You have to make it that, yeah, Clyde may be an idiot, but you need to believe that like the second he sees this woman pretty much naked in a window, it's like, okay, this guy's going to straight up do anything for this woman. And yeah, they do it. Even though there are points when like some of the car scenes and she's like freaking out on Hackman's wife, she looks like a feral goddamn cat. And he's just like, oh, you really do get why Clyde likes her, because she's a fucking lunatic. She is a Looney Tune.
Well, and I also love the idea of, how do we frame her? She's up on the second floor. Clyde's down below. We're giving her a sort of like fairy tale princess Rapunzel style introduction, right?
Yep.
Except instead of it being, Clyde is the prince who climbs up to rescue her. She's so desperate for excitement that she will, toss herself to the guy who's maybe trying to steal her mom's car.
Yep.
which is just such a that is one of those things in a way, and I've said it about, another film we talk about, The Graduate, that you can just pick it apart and find new things each time. And that is one of the virtues that this film has as well.
Yeah.
Is analyzing it, getting into it that way. I think one of the things that's kind of fun is the question of what does Bonnie think is going to come from her interactions with Clyde early on? Does she see him as her escape? Or does she see him as like the same way a cat sees a mouse? Like, well, this thing's here, I can bandy it about a little bit and then be done with it. Because there is something so interesting about when they're at the diner together and Clyde is doing his little trick where he can just describe everything about her and her simple little life. You watch her not only get kind of depressed by that, but also feel her power slip away. And that both depresses her and intrigues her.
And I think it's a little bit of both, because you almost get the sense that in that first scene where she tries to fuck him in the car, I think after that first robbery, and he's just like, I ain't no lover boy. You almost get the feeling like that's pretty much all she was trying to get out of this, just a little jolt from the day. But then seeing that while he may be able to read her, she really can't get a hold on him, because for all intents and purposes, a guy like Clyde, who's brazenly going to steal her mom's car in broad daylight and robs a convenience store and just, is that confident of a guy and is that good at, you think, yeah, this guy's just here to fuck. He's probably good at it too. Look at how charming he is and how smooth talking, how easy he can read women. He must do this to women all the time. Let's get this little jolt, get him in the field, and we're gonna fuck, and that'll be my excitement for the day. Probably not even thinking past getting a deep dicking. But then just like realize, like, wait a minute, what? You're not a lover boy?
And what ends up happening?
This is interesting.
And what ends up happening is, when does she finally start to feel that power again, that rush? That is when he shows her how to shoot the gun.
Yep.
And the scene where they try and go at it, right? They're in that little shack, and he, again, does that thing like, well, I told you I wasn't a lover. But when it becomes clear to her that he's impotent,
yeah,
right? What does she do? She rolls over dissatisfied, and what is her head resting against? The pistol. It isn't just that the impotency is a storyline for Clyde. It's the fact that the violence replaces her the sexual repression. And that in and of itself feels like quite frankly, a very American sentiment. That is
very American. That's what I've been saying this whole time about the movie. It's a joke to say, oh, his dick doesn't, but like it is a plot line in the movie. It is a thematic through line in the movie. She doesn't care because, hey, she could pick up a 6-shooting working dick in her hand and, get some excitement that way.
It's,
I mean, what do you think about them excluding him being gay out of the movie?
I think it depends on,
because they get it out of the way very quickly. Well, there ain't nothing wrong with me. I don't like boys or anything. It's just like, all right, well, I guess we're not doing that thing with Clyde. Whatever. Obviously, whatever. I don't care.
And also, like, who knows how true that is? He says that, but that's pretty defensive. But it's also the thing of, like, I think in the case of this, a thing they talk about in that documentary, that Revolution documentary, that I thought was interesting, is that Arthur Penn talked to this. Apparently, Beatty was like iffy on the whole thing for a myriad of reasons, some of which you can probably guess, vanity and so on. But Arthur Penn had a good point. And again, this is a documentary, a DVD feature from like 2003, right? Or 2002. So Arthur Penn saying this in 2002, or, the screenwriters talking about Arthur Penn saying this in like 2002, they're saying something that feels really profound. Now, obviously, it seems obvious, but apparently Penn told them, I want to take that out because Clyde's homosexuality in this film is from the vantage point of two straight men trying to conceive of what homosexuality is. So it feels inauthentic. Now, again, that's how we talk about things today, right? We talk about that a lot today of like, having that perspective, right? And needing, queer stories told by queer writers. We're very conscious of that today. But for that to be something that was being discussed in the 60s is interesting. It's an interesting thing to consider in that regard. And the other thing Penn said that I think is the counter to that is he said, the other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that he wasn't just saying we want to make these characters relatable, but he said we want to make sure that we don't put enough into this thing that people start to look at these characters and go, well, they're just a bunch of freaks. That there's a threshold of social aberration that an audience of that time would go along with before they stop empathizing with them or start going, well, that's just because they're XYZ, And I think those are both interesting elements, or both interesting ways to look at this that you wouldn't anticipate.
I think the Arthur Penn thing is the right way to look at it. You don't want to, not to, dilute it and minimize this shit in this way, but, you don't want to put a hat on a hat. So you get it. Try to strip some of it down and don't give people ammunition to be like, well, he's just a gay old freak, so of course he's he's committing crimes or whatever. So, that's good. I really don't, good on the writers for acknowledging that they might have some blind spots in terms of that. I think it's, not always the best excuse. We're writers. We can, have empathy and do research and just do all and, they're not fucking bank robbers and they still wrote this movie. But, yeah, good on Arthur Penn. That's the right excuse to me.
I thought that was such an interesting, again, talking about the context of the time, right? That's such an interesting thing to consider somebody considering in the 60s.
Penn's
and I don't
smart
think it's
guy for whatever, not the greatest filmography in the world, obviously, but he's made good stuff. I think Night Moves is his best movie,
But I think
he makes smart decisions. Like you brought up the fact that he lets the black guy shoot the gun too at the house, and he doesn't make that guy just seem like, he's not like a minstrel character, or he doesn't give him anything degrading to do.
And I think the other thing too is I would say removing the historical Clyde sexuality from the Bonnie and Clyde movie is not as egregious as if you wanted to remove the queer elements from Dog Day Afternoon.
Yes.
It's not as central
yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This is a love story between Bonnie and Clyde, right? This is the story of the love between Bonnie and Clyde. Their sexuality outside of that doesn't necessarily matter, Similar to and I'm not suggesting that, obviously queer representation in film is important, but I also think it doesn't necessarily, because it is a love story about these two characters. I go back to that sentiment earlier of Jules and Jim couldn't get it figured out and they didn't have to rob any banks, right? It took them the whole movie to figure out they didn't rob any banks. I think that, it didn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily either serve or disserve.
Well, I think in this case, 100%, the story they're telling, they're clearly not being historically accurate with this movie in almost 100 different ways, and that's fine. I just know the world we live in today, with every movie gets discoursed to death. If it was if they made a Bonnie and Clyde movie today, and Clyde's homosexuality, or I guess maybe bisexuality would be the right
it's not
term,
entirely
since he
clear,
does love. It's clearly it's about Bonnie, but whatever. That would be a whole thing, because there is a movie you can make about
Absolutely.
Bonnie and Clyde and that whole thing, which funnily enough would almost be like Maestro.
Yeah,
honestly, which is that that thing of oh, they love each other, but what is their love really? Because is he bi? Is he trying to convince himself he's bi? Is she okay that he's bi, or is she deluding herself into thinking he's bi? But either way, they still have this love for each other, but what is that love and all of
Well,
that shit?
it's funny you bring up Maestro, because I do think like one of the things that Bonnie and Clyde has going for it is they were picking American folk heroes, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, listen, you know Bonnie and Clyde, you know they rob banks, you know they get shot. We know that, right? Maestro, on the other hand, I think, one of the things that a lot of people struggled with is it's a movie that comes from the vantage point of, we all know Leonard Bernstein's life.
You guys
story,
are all from the Upper East Side, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the audience went, what? Meanwhile,
I'm sorry, I'm from Connecticut. I'm sorry, I'm from Upper New York.
When Bonnie and Clyde came out, and again, like we stressed, people remembered Bonnie and Clyde actually happening. The studio heads, Jack Warner apparently was just like, what are you talking about? Gangster pictures went out of vogue. Why are we doing this? Nobody wants gangster pictures anymore. They want lavish musicals like The Sound of Music. And that's why we're putting all our money into Camelot.
Good job, buddy.
A thing I hadn't realized, by the way, was that Bonnie and Clyde got pulled from theaters pretty early.
Yes,
that's how little faith
right.
Warner Brothers had, and they replaced it with like Reflections of a Golden Eye, and then only after the Oscars were like, okay, fine, we'll put Bonnie and Clyde back in theaters, I guess. What a weird thing.
What a stupid industry that we've decided to be obsessed with.
One of the things.
Send a comet now.
But I think there's an interesting thing too, right? Which is, Tom, you alluded to obviously Bonnie's shift when she sees the Undertaker, and obviously that comes again later when she's picking up the fallen child, and then she talks to her mother, and her mother's like, we can't live. You're not going to ever be able to settle down. Like, you're too far in, right? I had a thought this time around watching it too, which is obviously it's affecting Clyde too. He basically has a panic attack when his brother is reading off the list of crimes that they've been accused of in the newspaper. And at the beginning of the film, he's suave, right? He's suave, he's calm, cool, collected, he's charming, right? Yeah. Clyde's greatest asset is that he's charming. When they get to C.W. Moss's father's house, he's frantic the entire time, right?
Yep.
And I know that the movie tries to tell us and like alludes to the idea of like, well, C.W. Moss's dad is mad because his son has got a tattoo on his chest and all that, right? But one of the things that did strike me this time around is if Clyde was still the charming guy we met at the beginning, instead of the ranting and raving maniac, if he was still the charming guy we met at the beginning, does C.W. Moss's father even turn them in?
Well, I think it's even simpler than that, because when Moss's father meets them, he doesn't really meet them. They're bloody messes, unconscious in the car. Yeah. And at first he's like, "Why you got that tattoo on your chest?" And then he opens the car and sees their bloodied, fucked up, unconscious bodies. It clicks in his head. Oh, his son is in trouble. No matter what these two say or do when they wake up, he's never going to. Maybe, maybe if they came to Moss's farm, not bloody husks, and Clyde could be a charmer, maybe Moss's dad wouldn't have snitched them out. But what I do think is interesting is just one of those moments of your luck runs out. You ran into the one guy that just isn't falling for your shit.
But, with that too, I mean, I do think that's that thing of, I wonder in some ways, again, he comes to them beating him, the father finds him bloodied and all that, right?
Shot to shit.
If they were the quote unquote perfect victims, right? If they were begging for mercy or anything like that, maybe it's different.
Maybe.
Who can say?
But his father does know who they are by this point.
Yeah.
So
I'm saying at this point, Clyde is like Henry Hill, third act of Goodfellas.
Oh no! Once he's up and he reads the paper where they say he abandoned his brother when he was dying, and he's clearly a freak. He's out of his mind, no good. But I think it is interesting that you can kind of ask yourself that question, because the father knows who they are. They are famous. He knows that his son is now involved with these two.
Yeah.
You got to think that this, again, is just one of those cases of their luck ran out. We've seen the whole time. They just got lucky.
Yeah.
They're not smart. The first time they get ambushed by the cops, Clyde just so happens to be walking by the mirror and sees the cops coming up the alley, and they shoot their way out, and the fucking Hackman's wife is running around, so they have to divert off their escape path to go get her, and they're all freaking out on her. They barely escape the second ambush, but Hackman doesn't. The wife doesn't. She gets blinded.
Yeah.
It's a movie of just young love burning so hot that it can get you through a lot until it doesn't. Until the bill comes due.
And that's kind of the thing, is it's also the question in some ways of like, were they always fated to die?
Mm-hmm.
Was it a case of, you overplayed your hand, right? That kind of thing of like, not to evoke, but the Mike Ehrmantraut in Breaking Bad, like, we had a good thing going.
Yeah.
We could have kept it at that pace, but you had to go too far. That idea of like, you can drive your car and you can keep your foot on the pedal and you can go up 60, 70, 80, but at a certain point, when you push that speed too far, you're not going to be able to control that wheel the same way.
Yeah.
And, by the end of this movie, that's where they're at. They cannot control that wheel.
And it really is all just comes down to they are not professionals. They do not plan things out. They are not smart. And because it all comes down to they picked up some moron at a gas station to be their driver. Dipshit decides to park the car, which then leads to them shooting a guy in the face. And Clyde, for as much of a dumbass as he is, knows we have a murder charge now. They're never going to stop. It was a game at a certain point, and it's not like they're killing everybody at every bank robbery after that, but it does become, once those cops come, we're just opening fire. There's no hesitation anymore. Just that one where we think we're playing a game, almost like, young love, passionate, we can't stop fucking thing. And then it's like, well, we're pregnant. And you go, oh, fuck, there's consequences now? And if they just didn't just act like it was a fucking game to play because, oh, we're kids, we're having fun, oh yeah, great, blah blah blah, we're gonna have some excitement today. It all just barreled downhill. And
it's also this thing of, I don't know. I mean, there's the element of, obviously, like we said, if the system existed to protect them, or if the system it was balanced for everybody, they wouldn't be doing this. One of the things that I love is during the chase sequence, the car chase. This great bit where we're intercutting the car chase with all of the people talking to the newspaper, right?
Yeah.
And that great bit where the cop is, describing how he was so afraid for his life, right? And then after he gives that quote, big smile for the paper as they snap his picture. It's just, and the fact that, quite frankly, yeah, we can talk about the crimes they committed. They certainly killed people. No one's denying that. But the film is structured in such a way that who ends up delivering their comeuppance? It's the cop they embarrassed.
Yep.
Right? It's not a case of I'm out for revenge because you killed my partner. It's you made me look stupid. I have power and you made me look stupid. And maybe you can get away with that for a little bit, but I'm going to come a-calling. And when I do, we are going to riddle your body with bullets. And that's just such a... I mean, I want to take a second to talk about... I mean, we should talk about... There's so many things we could talk about. We could talk about so much more of how this film got made. But I want to take a second to talk about kind of two elements here. One, we have not yet talked about Estelle Parsons, who I think every time I watch this film becomes more and more the secret sauce of it. But also the cinematography on this film really just... I mean, we talked about that sequence where and the editing. I guess cinematography and editing, let's lump that together, the technical side of it. Because that scene where Bonnie goes to see her family, I just love that the whole look of the film shifts.
Yeah.
It becomes more dusty, takes on a almost Bergman-esque kind of feel, which I think is so great. And then obviously the ending, just the timing of that, the way when you feel them pulling up with that flat tire, pulling over to help them with the flat tire, I wrote down it absolutely feels like the "Don't that picture look a little dusty," Jesse James moment, and then Bonnie seeing the birds fly and a look of wonder on her face before that just absolute carnage of that massacre is really just remarkable. But so those are my two things I want to make sure we touch on. I don't know where your thoughts are either on the technical craft side of the film or on Estelle Parsons. So I want to just put both those out there and let you run however you want to run.
The movie looks great. I'm going to take a shot at this guy. This feels like a good version of a Peter Bogdanovich movie, the way it's like shot. Like this is like, what if Last Picture Show was like, watchable, evoking that dusty old, like middle America. Like I'm like, other than Targets, I don't like the guy. Like, rest in peace, dude. I don't know, whatever, but it looks great. The editing is great. It's definitely one of those things where you could definitely tell that, not that it necessarily influenced Peckinpah with the Wild Bunch, but it almost gave him the excuse of being like, see, they fucking did it. Let me do it then, assholes.
Yeah.
While he's chugging a fucking bottle with 3 X's on it, and he's got a fucking sawn off shotgun in his other hand. Looks great. Editing's great. Especially the editing of the ending, the pre-realization, realization, and then the slow-mo is great. All of that's good. And then fucking, what's her name? Estelle Parsons?
Estelle Parsons, yeah.
Yeah, I don't like her. I think she's annoying.
Well, she's meant to be. That's the entire point.
I know she's meant to be annoying, but I think it just tips over into being, well, no, I'm actually just annoyed that you're here. Like, you're very lucky that your dance partner is Gene Hackman, because good boy almighty, is that man just the best from the jump.
I thought that might have been where you went on this. I can tell with you with certain forms. That's why I kind of tried to package two together, two topics together, so I could just get out of this one as quick as I could. But again, there's so much we could get into with Bonnie and Clyde. It is, it is a landmark film, and we're not even talking about, and I don't think we can even get into the critical response to it at the time. It forced a critic to issue a retraction.
Yeah, wild critical reaction, just period of like you said, retraction. People fucking didn't know what to do with it. They hated it. Then they're like, oh, hey, we saw it again. I actually think it's great. All that. So such
the Catholic League, I think, endorsed the movie. It's very weird. The fact of the matter is, we cannot do it. Just anybody who is interested, we often like to say our mission statement on this show is, if you've watched one of these movies that's in the registry that's considered great, and you don't get it, you don't get what the big deal is, we are here to help you understand why it matters. That's always what we try and do with this. But at the same time, if you are still feeling like you don't get Bonnie and Clyde, I cannot recommend Pictures of the Revolution by Mark Harris enough.
Great book. Great fucking book.
It is a great read. It is a quick read. You'll blow through it, but it focuses on those 5. I mean, it talks about a lot of other movies too, but it really focuses on those 5 picture nominees from that year, and what they mean to this pivotal period in Hollywood. So with that in mind, wrapping up as we always do, Tom, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Actually, one, how do you think Bonnie and Clyde fared at the Academy Awards that year? And 2, evoking Pictures of the Revolution and all that, we've talked about a lot of them today. Can you name the 5 Best Picture nominees from 1967? The 5 movies discussed in Pictures of the Revolution.
All right.
Whichever one you want to do first. If you want to do how you think Bonnie and Clyde did versus the totality of the nominees for that year.
Well, I'm gonna take a shot in the dark and say it was nominated for Best Picture, but it did not win.
Mm-hmm.
And
but what else? Or which way are we going?
I don't know. Supporting actor. with not supporting actor, actress for Faye Dunaway.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. You mentioned the cinematography and editing before, so I'll say cinematography and editing it got nominated for. I don't think it won anything.
So here we go. So it was nominated for Best Picture. I won't say the other nominees yet. Actually, no. You know what, Tom? Let's shift over. I'll go through the rest. What were the 5 picture nominees that year? You know, Bonnie and Clyde. What
Bonnie
are the
and Clyde, In the Heat of the Night,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Dolittle.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck.
I mean, one of them we talked about a lot in Contrast because it's, in my opinion, the greatest American film ever made.
Oh, well, The Graduate, yeah.
Uh-huh. And then that other one.
That other pesky son. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner?
There we go. Those are the 5. And you say you don't remember things. So,
I don't.
What Bonnie and Clyde was nominated for Best Picture alongside, as you mentioned, Dr. Dolittle, Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and the winner, In the Heat of the Night. Actually racked up a fair number of nominations. Didn't win much because the old guard's still winning there. But let's talk about what else it was nominated for. It was nominated for Best Director, but it lost to Mike Nichols for The Graduate. And if you were wondering, that year, Dr. Dolittle passed over for Best Director, believe it or not.
What do you
Richard
know?
Fleischer does not get nominated. Instead, it's the Richard Baxter, I think, the director of In Cold Blood. Which, as you and I were talking about via text, Tom, as Mark Harris notes, there was a good chance. Most people expected that either The Dirty Dozen or In Cold Blood could have picked up that 5th Best Picture slot.
And boy, In Cold Blood is great, but fuck, I would have loved if The Dirty Dozen got nominated for Best Picture. I love that movie.
Tom, you might be surprised to discover it does better than you'd think at the Oscars. In fact, you know what? I'd like to, if it's okay, I'm actually just going to, because it's such a crazy year, and I have some weird facts I want to point out, I'm actually going to pull up just the nominees of that year. I don't just want to say what won, because there's some surprises in there for you that I think you're going to enjoy. So, Best Director, as I mentioned, the only one that's swapped out from picture is Richard Brooks for In Cold Blood. It was nominated for Best Actor for Warren Beatty. He gets a Best Actor nomination. He was nominated alongside Dustin Hoffman for The Graduate, Spencer Tracy posthumously for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Paul Newman for Cool Hand Luke.
Hell yeah.
But they all lose to Rod Steiger for In the Heat of the Night. It was nominated for Best Actress, as you mentioned, Tom, for Faye Dunaway. The other nominees in that category, Anne Bancroft for The Graduate, Edith Evans for The Whisperers, which I have not yet seen. But she's like the last, I believe Edith Evans is the last Academy Award nominee born in the 1880s.
Oh,
an old lady. Audrey Hepburn is nominated for Wait Until Dark.
Hell
but
yeah.
The winner, in a surprise to a lot of people, Katharine Hepburn for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. It is not Bonnie and Clyde gets nominated twice in Supporting Actor. Michael J. Pollard and Gene Hackman are both nominated for Best Supporting Actor. But wait until you hear the other nominees. So Cecil Kellaway is nominated for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Also, John Cassavetes for The Dirty Dozen is nominated.
Fucking yes.
They all lose to George Kennedy for Cool Hand Luke. Now, a lot of people thought Michael Pollard was taking home that Oscar, but it ends up going to George Kennedy for Cool Hand Luke, which is a fine performance. I have nothing against that performance. I'm on board with it. But okay. It was also nominated for Supporting Actress for Estelle Parsons, which it won.
Wow.
This was the one acting win that they give it. And apparently it was a shock to everyone. So the other nominees in that category, for the record, Carol Channing for Thoroughly Modern Millie, Mildred Natwick for Barefoot in the Park, Bea Richards for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and I'll be honest, the one I would give it to, no disrespect to Del Parsons, Catherine Ross for The Graduate. So.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, the other categories that it's in, It was nominated for what they then called Best Story and Screenplay Written Directly for the Screen, now Best Original Screenplay. A lot of people thought that would win because, come on, that screenplay. But it ends up losing to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which outraged a fair number of people.
Hey, what if there was a dinner?
It was nominated for Best Costume Design, but lost to Camelot, the Warner Brothers musical. And lastly, it was nominated for and won Best Cinematography.
Nice.
So it picked up 2 Oscars that night, a lot less than people expected, because it ended up going in the heat of the night's way. And let me tell you, it's a weird Oscars. It's a weird year.
Sure sounds like it.
Speaking of sound, Dirty Dozen picked up Best Sound Effects Oscar. So,
Goddamn right it does.
Something. In any event, that is what we had to say about Bonnie and Clyde. I had other things I could note. I don't know if you were aware of this. Did I mention this in the episode that Warren Beatty wanted Bob Dylan for the role of Clyde?
No.
Before he cast himself?
You did not mention that.
Yep. Dylan was really in the air because apparently Michael Pollard modeled his accent off of what Bob Dylan sounded like on Blonde on Blonde. So a lot of Dylan in the air at the time. But that is our thoughts on Bonnie and Clyde. We're just going to say it. This is, obviously, like, if you guys listened to our Big Business episode, it was just Tom and I. We thought that would be a fun bit. We're deep enough in this show now. We wanted to try and see if, like, if we could just sustain some episodes, just the two of us. We hope this worked. If you guys are digging this, if you guys are cool with that, if you guys want or are okay with it, or digging more episodes that are just Tom and I talking about the movies, let us know. Leave a review on iTunes, or if you're enjoying our nascent but growing YouTube channel, leave a comment and let us know. If you're digging this, or shoot us a message on Twitter or email us, yourmissingoutpodcast@gmail.com. We'd actually like your feedback on this. Even Tom would tolerate your feedback on this, and that's saying something.
Don't speak for me.
But yeah, if you guys are digging this, let us know. We're trying to, as we reach that 100 episode milestone that's somehow scarily close, we are playing around with the format a bit, trying to toy around with some things. So let us know what you thought. But for right now, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So one of the things that was challenging, I was texting Tom before we did this that I even switched my pick last minute. There's so many ways you could go with Bonnie and Clyde. But one of the things I thought about and I was trying to think about was the impact that it had, the way that it tapped into this kind of confluence of sex, violence, and youth, right? And it's the way that it felt daring and transgressive and wasn't really understood properly in its time. Like, obviously, it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, but it didn't win that many. And we talked a little bit about the critical reception and the people who were like, well, it's too violent, this and that. So I was trying to think in that direction, right? Of what have been those other dam-bursting movies. And in a lot of ways, I think in the decades since, those dam-bursting movies didn't end up being the theatrical critical sensation of a Bonnie and Clyde. They didn't get re-released in theaters. They found a second life on VHS, right? The more contemporary, transgressive youth films end up becoming cult classics on video and later, DVD and streaming and what have you. And again, I was trying to think of something that spoke to the times and their respective times, and something that, teenagers watched and continue to watch and feel something with, but grown-ups of the time start to go, I don't know about this. I don't know about the messaging of this. And also the element of Bonnie in it and the way that she turns toward this dangerous criminal guy and gets kind of addicted to the rush of it. But at a certain point, they realize, oh, this has gotten too out of hand. And there is, of course, a film that I don't know. I genuinely wonder if it's considered a cult classic still or if it's fully a classic. I think when we were teenagers, it was a cult classic. And I think now it's just widely accepted as part of the canon, which is 1988's Heathers. I think that is Heathers is for the 80s in a way what Bonnie and Clyde is for the 60s. I don't mean in terms of the success or anything like that, but I do think tapping into a certain kind of energy, right? And a certain kind of frustration and angst. There, as I said to Tom via text, there were a couple more obvious one-to-ones I could have gone with here that I will probably talk about some other time that all deserve to be in the registry. But there's something about the particular energy that Heathers has. I almost can't put it into words. But beyond the violence, beyond the romance of it, there's just a certain kind of angsty melancholy that lives within both Bonnie and Clyde and Heathers. And they're both dark comedies that make you say, I shouldn't necessarily be laughing at this. You know, their violence is shocking. And they're both films that are kind of about how this system has failed, right? This system has failed, so why should we follow it? So for that reason, and for all the other reasons, quite frankly, I think Heathers absolutely deserves a place in the National Film Registry. So my nomination is Heathers.
All right, I dig that. I mean, I am going obvious with mine. It is a 1-to-1, but I do think they are kind of just fundamentally just great double features in terms of the story and in terms of its social satire. So what the things it's saying about the world that exists in when it was made and when it's set. It was an incredibly divisive movie then. It's still an incredibly divisive movie now. I'm going with The Natural Born Killers. I mean, it's the obvious choice. I mean, because you could go with True Romance, but I don't think it's really the same thing. It's not. True Romance isn't really doing the same thing. The Natural Born Killers is the 90s ADHD fucking Ritalin MTV version of what Bonnie and Clyde was doing. You got two unrepentant criminals. There's nothing romantic about what they're doing. It's satirizing the era it's in, the 90s, in terms of the way the world is just kind of numbing itself, thinking everything's great, and look at all the TV and capitalism and all the shit we got, and we're just numb to everything, but there's actually a horrible rot underneath everything, and we profit off of the misery of others and all this shit. And that when true, absolute, amoral, just animals like Mickey and Mallory show up, they become just content for the fucking masses. People just ignore that these are horrific, brutal monsters that rape and kill throughout the movie. And then when the jailbreak happens, you know, it comes back to bite the media in the ass. The snake eating its own tail kind of thing. You know, if it doesn't really hit in the same, you know, impact on cinema way that Bonnie and Clyde does, that's really because not many movies can really do that, lay a claim to that. But it comes damn near close in terms of how it pissed people the fuck off and how it's still a movie that you cannot have just like a simple conversation about because it drives people fucking bananas. Depending on the day and the time of day, I might tell you this is Oliver Stone's crowning achievement. It is a masterpiece of just, you know, agitprop cinema. And it's obvious, but what else do you pair fucking Bonnie and Clyde with, man? There's a few options, and this is one of them. Natural Born Killers. What a fucking picture.
Next week,
Michael H. Weber returns to the show to discuss Paths of Glory.
That's why I love that shot early on where when the two generals are talking about the mission initially, at the very beginning of the movie, I mean, they must walk 3 miles in that scene. They just wander around in circles, and they are just walking and moving, and they're going nowhere. And it really kind of previews everything to come in a way.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natale and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natale and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. We don't watch you, you're watching us.